Montereau, France, August 25, 1944. A bend in the river Seine, wide and brown and moving slow under a summer sky. On the southern bank, a small man in a wet uniform is dragging himself and a boat full of wounded men out of the water. He is not a rifleman. He carries no weapon at all. On his left arm is a white band with a red cross, and on his helmet another red cross, painted there so that everyone can see exactly what he is. He is a medic. His name is Harold Garman, and he is roughly 5 feet 4 inches tall, which is to say, he is one of the smallest men in his company. Nobody who watched him climb aboard the truck to France a year earlier would have picked him out as the man the newsreel cameras would eventually follow. Nobody would have guessed that the most feared and famous American general of the entire war would one day stand in front of him in a ruined German town, come to a halt, and salute him first. That is where this story is going, but it does not start there, and the honest version is stranger and better than the version you may have seen attached to a dramatic title. So let us take our time and get it exactly right. Start with the thing that is easiest to underestimate, which is the medic himself. In the American Army of the Second World War, the combat medic was a strange figure. He went into battle with his comrades, into the same fire, across the same open ground, and he did it carrying bandages and morphine instead of a rifle. When a man was hit and screamed the single word that every veteran of that war remembered for the rest of his life, the word medic, it was this figure who was expected to stand up, in the open, and go toward the sound. He was expected to do the one thing that every instinct in a frightened human being fights against. He was expected to move toward the shooting while everyone else pressed themselves into the earth. And yet, before the shooting started, the medic was often not respected at all. That part is true, and it is documented, and it matters to this story. A large number of American medics were draftees who had asked for non-combatant roles. A smaller but very real number were conscientious objectors, men who for religious reasons refused to carry a weapon or to kill. In training camps across the United States, these men were frequently mocked. They were called cowards. They were called slackers. Some were told to their faces that they were hiding behind the Red Cross because they were afraid to fight. The historian Stephen Ambrose, who interviewed hundreds of veterans, wrote that some soldiers felt the medics cast a kind of moral shadow over what the infantry was training to do, which was to kill. A man who would not carry a rifle was, to some of his fellow trainees, a walking accusation. So the first half of the famous title is not a lie. Medics really were doubted. Medics really were mocked. The phenomenon was real and widespread, and any honest account of these men has to begin with the contempt many of them absorbed before they ever saw a battlefield. What happened next is the part the mockers never expected. Because the same army records that preserve the doubt also preserve the reversal, and the reversal is total. A United States Army study conducted after the war looked into how frontline infantry actually regarded their medics once the fighting was real. The finding was blunt. The infantry, the study concluded, will not accept a mediocre or inferior soldier as a company aid man. A qualified aid man, it went on, is held in the highest esteem by the combat soldier. Stephen Ambrose put the same truth more plainly. In training, he wrote, the medics were sometimes scorned. In combat, they were loved and admired without stint. The cartoonist Bill Mauldin, who drew the tired and filthy infantrymen of the Italian campaign and who spoke for them better than almost anyone, called the medic the private soldier's family doctor. That is the arc. Mocked in the camp, worshipped in the field. The question this story has to answer is why? What did these men do that turned scorn into something close to reverence? And how did one of them, a small, quiet draftee from southern Illinois, end up being decorated in person by General George Patton? The obvious answer is the wrong one, or at least it is far too simple. It is tempting to say that the medics won respect just by being brave, as though courage alone explains it. But courage was everywhere in that war. The rifleman who assaulted a machine gun nest was brave. The tank crew that rolled forward into anti-tank fire was brave. Bravery was the price of admission to the battlefield, not the thing that set the medic apart. If you want to understand why the combat medic occupied a place in the infantry's heart that almost no one else did, you have to look at the specific and terrible mathematics of the job. Consider what the medic actually faced. He worked where the wounded were, and the wounded were wherever the fire was heaviest. He could not choose good cover because the man he had to reach had usually fallen in bad cover or in no cover at all. He knelt in the open to work. He was often the only man on the field, deliberately staying still and upright in a place everyone else was trying to leave, and the casualty rates reflected it. One study of American divisions with long combat experience found that many of them, after about 6 months of hard fighting, had effectively lost 100% of their company aid men to death or wounds. Read that again slowly. Not 100% of the division, 100% of the medics. The men whose entire purpose was to preserve life were, statistically, among the most likely of all to lose their own. The infantry knew this. They watched it happen. They watched the medic they had mocked in Georgia or Texas walk into fire to drag out a man he had never met, and they revised their opinion of him at the speed that only combat allows. That is the engine underneath the reversal, not abstract bravery, but the specific, repeated, visible willingness to trade one's own safety for someone else's survival, over and over, until the odds caught up. If stories like this one matter to you, the real history underneath the legends, the actual documented men, rather than the invented ones, then consider subscribing and leaving a like. It genuinely helps this kind of careful history reach more people who care about getting it right. Now, to understand the specific man at the center of this story, we have to understand the army that produced him, and the equipment and doctrine that shaped what a medic could and could not do. Because Harold Garman did not save lives in a vacuum. He saved them inside a system, and that system is a large part of why the American wounded survived at rates the soldiers of earlier wars would have found almost unbelievable. The American medical chain of the Second World War was built like a series of nets, each one further back from the fighting, each one more capable than the last. It began with the man himself, the company aid man, working at the very front. His job was not surgery. His job was to keep a wounded man alive long enough to reach someone who could do more. He stopped bleeding with pressure, and with the newly issued field dressings each soldier carried. He sprinkled sulfur powder into wounds to fight infection, a practice the army pushed hard in the middle years of the war. He gave morphine from small syrettes, little collapsible tubes with a needle, to hold back the shock that killed so many wounded men before their injuries alone would have. And then he got the man moving, back through the chain, from the aid man to the battalion aid station, from the aid station to the collecting station, then to the clearing station, then to an evacuation hospital, and if needed, further back still to a general hospital. Each step meant more trained hands, more equipment, and more chance of living. It is worth pausing on how a man became this first link, because the training itself tells you something about how the army regarded the job. A combat medic was not simply an infantryman handed a bag of bandages. He went through a specialized course, learning anatomy in a rough, practical form, learning how to control bleeding, how to recognize and treat shock, how to splint a shattered limb, how to manage a chest wound or a belly wound long enough to get the man rearward. He learned to do all of this quickly, with cold hands, in bad light, under the worst pressure a human being can face, with the patient often screaming and the ground around him alive with fire. And then he was sent to a line company, usually one aid man to a platoon of some 40 men, and those men became, in a real sense, his responsibility. He learned their faces, he knew their names. When one of them was hit, it was not an abstract casualty he was crawling toward. It was someone he had shared a foxhole with the night before. Consider what he carried, because the contents of a medic's kit are a kind of portrait of the era's medicine. He carried field dressings, thick pads of bandage sealed against dirt to press onto wounds and stop bleeding. He carried sulfur, both as powder to pour directly into a wound and as tablets to hold back the infection that had killed so many wounded men in earlier wars before they ever reached a surgeon. He carried morphine in small syrettes, each a tiny tube with its own needle, so that a man in unbearable pain or sliding into shock could be given relief with a single quick injection. Medics learned to pin the empty syrette to the wounded man's collar or to mark an M on his forehead, so that the next medical man down the line would know a dose had already been given and would not accidentally give a second that might kill him. He carried tourniquets, scissors to cut away clothing and boots, safety pins, and the paper tags on which he recorded what he had found and what he had done, tags that followed the wounded man back through every station of the chain. It was a small kit, light enough to run with, and in the hands of a trained man it was the difference between a soldier who bled out in a field and a soldier who went home. There is a physical reason speed mattered so much, and it is the grim engine underneath everything the medic did. A man with a severe wound to a major blood vessel can lose consciousness in a couple of minutes and die not long after. Shock, the collapse of the body's circulation after serious injury, can kill a man whose actual wound might have been survivable, simply because help did not reach him in time. The medic's true enemy was not only the bullet, it was the clock. Every minute a wounded man lay untreated, his chances fell. This is why the medic could not wait for the fire to slacken, could not sensibly hang back until the position was secure. By the time the ground was safe, the man he was meant to save would often already be dead. The entire logic of his role forced him forward, into the danger, immediately, because the only treatment that mattered was the treatment given in the first minutes. The medic ran toward the wounded, not out of recklessness, but out of arithmetic. He understood, better than anyone, exactly how little time he had. The numbers this system produced were remarkable for their time. A wounded American soldier who reached medical care alive had a very strong chance of surviving, far stronger than in any previous American war. The scale of the improvement can be put in a single comparison. Of the American wounded who reached treatment in the First World War, roughly 8 in every 100 died of their wounds. In the Second World War, with the aid chain and the new drugs and the faster evacuation all working together, that figure fell to fewer than 5 in 100. Behind that drop in a single number lie hundreds of thousands of men who lived and went home, who, in an earlier war, would not have. Blood plasma, and later whole blood, moved forward toward the fighting in quantities no army had ever managed before. New drugs, especially penicillin, as it became available in the later years of the war, turned infections that would once have been death sentences into survivable complications. But every part of that system depended on the first link. None of the hospitals or the plasma or the penicillin could do anything for a man who bled to death in the first 10 minutes in a field, with no one willing to come and get him. The entire elaborate machine rested on the nerve of the man with the Red Cross armband who was closest to the fighting. That is worth holding on to, because it is the key to why a single medic's action could matter so much. He was the thin edge of everything. He was the difference between a wounded man and a dead one, in the minutes when the difference was still possible to change. There is one more piece of context that this story needs, and it is a difficult one. It concerns the Red Cross itself, the marking that Garman wore on his arm and his helmet. Under the rules of war as they existed then, laid out in the Geneva Convention, a medic who carried no weapon and wore that marking was not supposed to be a target. He was a non-combatant, protected, in theory, by international agreement. In the fighting in Northwest Europe, that protection was real often enough that most American medics chose to wear the Red Cross openly and to go unarmed, betting that being visibly a medic was safer than being mistaken for a rifleman. But the protection was never guaranteed. In the noise and confusion and rage of close combat, the Red Cross was sometimes no protection at all. Machine guns did not always pause to read a man's armband, and so the medic lived in a terrible grey space. He was marked as a man who should not be shot, moving constantly through places where men were being shot as fast as bullets could travel. Whether the marking saved him or not often came down to luck, and to the specific enemy in front of him on a specific day. There is a further cruelty in that grey space, and it shaped how medics chose to work. In the fighting against Germany in the West, most American medics judged that the Red Cross gave them enough real protection to be worth wearing openly, and so they went unarmed and visibly marked, trusting the enemy across the field to respect the convention often enough to keep them alive. But this was a bet, not a guarantee, and every medic knew it. In the Pacific War against Japan, many American medics reached the opposite conclusion. There, the Red Cross was widely felt to draw fire rather than turn it away, and so medics in that theater frequently carried weapons and hid their markings, blending in with the riflemen rather than standing out as protected men. The same job, the same Red Cross, produced opposite survival strategies on opposite sides of the world, and the difference tells you how thin and conditional the medic's protection really was. Harold Garman, wearing his cross openly on a French riverbank, was trusting to a convention that the German machine gunner, 100 yards away, was under no physical compulsion to honor. On that day, the gunner fired at the boat regardless. The cross on Garman's arm did not stop a single bullet. It only marked him, for anyone watching, as the man who had no business swimming out into that fire and did it anyway. Hold all of that in your mind, because now we can finally return to the river and to the 15 minutes that turned a small, unremarkable draftee into a man whose name General Patton would learn. By August of 1944, the war in France had broken open. In June, the Allies had landed in Normandy and then spent weeks grinding through the hedgerow country in a slow and bloody stalemate. But by late July, the American army had punched through the German defenses in an operation that shattered the front, and through that gap poured the tanks and trucks and infantry of a fast-moving pursuit. This was the moment Patton's Third Army became famous. It raced across France, covering in days ground that planners had expected to take months. The Germans, badly beaten in Normandy, were falling back toward their own border, and the Americans were chasing them across a country full of rivers. Rivers are the natural enemy of a fast advance. An army can race across open country, but a river forces it to stop, to concentrate, to cross on narrow bridges or on boats, and while it is crossing, it is vulnerable. The Germans knew this. As they retreated, they fought hardest at the rivers, trying to hold each one long enough to slow the pursuit and buy time to organize the next defense further back. One of those rivers was the Seine, the great river that loops through northern France and through Paris itself. And one of the places the Americans had to cross it was near the town of Montereau, southeast of Paris, where Harold Garman's unit, part of the 5th Infantry Division of Patton's Third Army, was fighting to enlarge a foothold on the far bank. A river crossing under fire is one of the oldest and most dangerous operations in warfare, and it is worth understanding why, because the danger is exactly what makes Garman's action what it was. On open ground, a soldier under fire has options. He can run, crawl, use folds in the earth, and throw himself behind a wall or a wrecked vehicle or into a ditch. Water offers none of that. A man in a boat, or swimming, is held up on a flat surface with nothing to hide behind and nowhere to go but slowly forward or slowly back. He cannot dig in. He cannot take cover. He is, for the whole length of the crossing, a target moving at the speed of a paddle or a swimmer's arms, which is to say, barely moving at all from the point of view of a gunner watching him. This is why defenders fought so hard at rivers. A machine gun sighted to cover a stretch of water commanded a killing zone that the attacker had to cross in the open, at a crawl, with no way to shoot back effectively while doing it. The men who cross first, into a bank still held or contested by the enemy, are horribly exposed. And the wounded from that crossing present a special problem. They cannot walk back. They have to be carried. And near a river, that often means they have to be brought back across the water in boats. On that day at Montereau, the wounded were being ferried to the safer southern shore in assault boats. Small craft paddled across the current, and among the men doing the paddling and the carrying were medics and litter-bearers like Garman. Picture the specific moment, as the official record preserves it. A boat is out on the river, midway across, carrying wounded men toward the southern bank. The current is slow and steady. And then, from a commanding position on the northern bank, roughly 100 yards away, a German machine gun opens fire on the boat. 100 yards is nothing for a machine gun. At that range, a trained crew can put a stream of bullets exactly where it wants them. The water around the boat begins to jump and spray as rounds strike it. For the men in that boat, there is no cover. There is no armor, no earth, nothing but the thin sides of a small craft and the open water. Most of the men in the boat did the only thing they could. They went into the river, over the sides, trying to get below the surface and away from the fire. But 3 men could not. One was too badly wounded to move at all. He lay in the boat, helpless, unable to save himself. 2 others could not swim, and so they clung to the sides of the boat, trapped, with the machine gun finding its range and the boat drifting under fire with no one to guide it. From the southern shore, Harold Garman saw all of this. He saw the boat, and the wounded man who could not move, and the 2 men clinging to the sides, and the water leaping around them. And he understood, in the way that only the men who were actually there ever fully understood, exactly what it would mean to go out there. It would mean swimming, slowly, across open water, directly into the cone of fire of a machine gun that already had the range. It would mean being, for the length of that swim, the most exposed and helpless target on the entire river. He went anyway. Without hesitation, the citation says, he plunged into the Seine. He swam directly into the machine gun fire, out toward the drifting boat. There was no cover to use and no speed to be had, because a man swimming and towing cannot move fast. He simply had to cross the open water while the gun fired at him, reach the boat, take hold of it, and then turn and drag it back toward the southern shore, still under aimed fire the entire way. The physical effort alone, towing a boat loaded with helpless men across a river, would be exhausting for a large, strong man. Garman was neither large nor, by the standards of his company, physically imposing. He did it regardless. He reached the boat, and he towed it, foot by foot, back across the Seine to the safety of the southern bank, and in doing so, he saved the lives of all 3 of the men who could not save themselves. That is the action. But the part that matters almost as much came next, and it is the part that explains why this particular rescue rippled outward. Because Garman's comrades were watching. The men on the southern shore had seen the boat come under fire, and had seen, presumably, the natural and human hesitation that such a scene produces, the terrible pause when everyone understands what needs to be done, and everyone also understands what it will likely cost. And then they saw the smallest man among them go into the water and do it. The official record puts it carefully. His heroism, it says, so inspired his comrades that additional assault boats were immediately procured, and the evacuation of the wounded resumed. In other words, his single act broke the paralysis. Other men, seeing what he had done, went and got more boats, and the work of saving the wounded went on. One man's refusal to accept that the crossing was impossible changed the behavior of everyone who saw it. This is the thing that the men who mocked medics in the training camps never understood in advance, and could only learn by watching. The medic's courage was not just about the men he personally carried. It was contagious. It set the standard for what was possible in a moment when the standard was in doubt. Garman did not fire a shot. He did not kill anyone. And yet his action at that river shaped the outcome of the crossing more than many a rifleman's did, because he restored to the men around him the belief that the wounded could be reached. It is worth remembering what the crossing at Montereau was part of, because it places Garman's single act inside the larger machine of the war. The Seine was one of the last great natural barriers before the German border, and getting across it in force in late August of 1944 was a significant step in the pursuit that followed the breakout from Normandy. Every wounded man pulled back alive from a contested bank was a man who might return to the fight, or who might simply live, and multiplied across a whole army. The difference made by medics like Garman was enormous. The 5th Infantry Division, his division, was one of the workhorse formations of Patton's Third Army, a unit that fought across France and later through some of the hardest battles on the approach to Germany. The men in it did not have the luxury of pausing to gather their wounded in safety. They fought a war of movement, of rivers and towns and rapid advances, and the wounded fell wherever the advance met resistance, which was everywhere. In that kind of war, the medic who could reach a man quickly and get him rearward through the chain was not a luxury. He was the reason the division could keep spending men and still have men left to spend. For that action on the Seine, Harold Garman was recommended for the Medal of Honor, the highest award for valor that the United States can give. And here the story moves toward the moment in the title, though the truth of that moment is both more modest and more powerful than the phrase Patton asked for him by name would suggest. So let us be careful and get it right, because getting it right is the whole point. If you are finding this account worth your time, a like helps it reach more viewers, and subscribing means you will not miss the next deep dive into the real history behind the war, the documented men, rather than the invented legends. First, the honest truth about the famous title. There is no record, none, of General Patton asking for a medic by name before a battle, or summoning a specific medic he had heard of, or any of the dramatic scenarios that titles like this one tend to suggest. That version, the one where the great general demands the humble medic by name, is a story shape, a formula that gets attached to many different soldiers to make a thumbnail worth clicking. If you went looking for a documented moment where Patton said a medic's name and called for him, you would not find it, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you something that the historical record does not contain. This story is better than that invention, and it is better precisely because it is true. Here is what actually happened, and it is remarkable enough that it needs no exaggeration. Harold Garman's Medal of Honor was approved and authorized in the spring of 1945 by a formal War Department order dated the 29th of March. But an award on paper is one thing. The presentation, the actual pinning of the medal onto the man's chest, is another, and it is the presentation that connects Garman to Patton. On the 6th of April 1945, in the German town of Lich, in the region of Hesse, General George Patton personally presented the Medal of Honor to Harold Garman. And the reason we can be so certain of this, the reason it is not a matter of legend at all, is that it was filmed. United States Army cameras recorded the ceremony. The footage still exists. In it you can see the commanding general of the Third Army, one of the most famous soldiers of the 20th century, standing before a small, quiet medic from Illinois. You can see Patton salute him. You can see him place the medal and shake the man's hand and pat his shoulder. Beside them stands Major General Leroy Irwin, the commander of the 5th Infantry Division, Garman's own division. Think about what that image actually contains, because it is far more meaningful than the invented version. This is George Patton. This is the general who, less than 2 years earlier in Sicily, had walked into military hospitals and struck soldiers he believed were faking illness to escape combat. The details of those incidents are worth knowing, because they are the true measure of the man doing the saluting. In the summer of 1943, during the Sicily campaign, Patton visited evacuation hospitals to see the wounded, something he did often and genuinely believed in. On one such visit, early in August, he came upon a soldier who bore no visible wound. When Patton asked what was wrong with him, the man said something to the effect that it was his nerves that he could not stand the shelling anymore. Patton exploded. He cursed the man, called him a coward, and slapped him across the face with his glove and ordered him out of the tent. What Patton did not know, or did not care to learn, was that the soldier was in fact ill, running a fever, sick with malaria. A week or so later, at a different hospital, almost the same scene repeated. Patton found another soldier who said his nerves could not take the shelling. This time, Patton was said to have been even more enraged. He struck the man, drew or brandished his pistol, and raved about cowardice in front of the hospital staff. The soldier was young, frightened, and genuinely suffering from what the era crudely called battle fatigue, and what we would now understand as a real injury of the mind under sustained bombardment. The medical staff who witnessed these scenes were appalled, and they did not stay silent. Reports moved up the chain of command until they reached General Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, who was furious, and who understood at once how damaging the incidents were. Eisenhower ordered Patton to apologize to the men he had struck and to the units involved. The episode became public and nearly destroyed Patton's career. He was kept out of a command role for months. It tells you something hard and real about the man. Patton had a fierce, sometimes cruel contempt for what he saw as weakness. He believed, and later wrote, that the greatest weapon against battle fatigue was ridicule. He was not a soft man, he was not a man who gave his respect easily or cheaply, and he was capable of real injustice towards soldiers whose suffering did not fit his idea of courage. And that is exactly why the film of Lich matters, because here is that same hard man, that same general who had so little patience for what he judged as cowardice, standing at attention and saluting a 5'4" medic who had never fired a shot in anger. Patton did not need a title writer to invent a moment for him. He gave the moment himself, in front of the cameras, of his own choosing. The general who despised weakness recognized, in this small, unarmed man, something he valued above almost everything else, which was raw physical courage in the presence of death. Garman had it, and Patton, whatever his many faults, could see it and would honor it in person. So the real version of the title is this: not that Patton asked for him by name, but that Patton, the most demanding judge of courage in the entire American army, chose to pin the nation's highest honor on a mocked and underestimated medic with his own hands, and to salute him first. That is not a downgrade from the legend. It is the legend's true and better source. To understand just how much that salute meant, it helps to understand Patton himself, because the contrast between the general and the medic is the real heart of this story. George Patton was a warrior in the oldest sense of the word. He believed in the offensive, in speed, in aggression, in hitting the enemy harder and faster than the enemy could bear. He cultivated a fearsome image on purpose: the ivory-handled pistols, the polished helmet, the harsh, profane speeches meant to burn the fear out of young soldiers and replace it with fury. He believed that war was decided by the will to attack, and he had contempt for hesitation. His whole theory of soldiering was built around the man who moves forward and closes with the enemy. And a combat medic is, in a strange way, the mirror image of everything Patton preached, and yet the perfect proof of it. The medic also moves forward. The medic also closes with the danger, but he does it carrying no weapon, for no purpose of killing, driven not by the will to destroy the enemy, but by the refusal to abandon a friend. Patton's soldiers ran toward the enemy. The medic ran toward the wounded, which often meant the same terrible ground. In the medic, Patton could see his own creed of forward movement and courage, stripped down to its purest form. Courage with nothing to gain and everything to lose. Courage without even the grim satisfaction of striking back. Perhaps that is why the film shows what it shows. Perhaps the hardest apostle of the offensive spirit recognized, in the unarmed man before him, the very thing he spent his life trying to summon in others. Now, the careful listener will have noticed something. This story has been honest about the fact that the dramatic title is a formula, and honest about the fact that Garman was mocked only in the general sense that medics as a group were often mocked, not necessarily in some specific documented humiliation of his own. So let us be equally honest and clear about what we do know of the man himself, and what we do not, because a true story respects the boundary between them. Harold Alva Garman was born on the 26th of February, 1918, in Fairfield, Illinois, in Wayne County, in the flat farming country of the southern part of the state. He was associated with the nearby town of Albion in Edwards County, and it was from there that he entered the army in 1942. He was, by every account, an ordinary young American of his time and place, a small man from a small town in a rural corner of the Middle West, drawn into a global war along with millions of others. When he did the thing that earned him the Medal of Honor, he held the rank of private, one of the lowest in the army. By the time he left the service, he had risen to technician 5th grade, a rank roughly equivalent to a corporal, often held by men with a specialist skill. There is a detail from his own later account that captures the man better than any citation can. Asked about that swim across the Seine into machine gun fire, Garman reportedly shrugged it off by comparing the great French river to a small river back home. The current, he is said to have remarked, was slow and steady, just like the Little Wabash. The Little Wabash is a modest river that winds through the very counties of southern Illinois where Garman grew up. It is the kind of river a farm boy swims in on a summer afternoon, and there is something almost unbearably telling in a man who has just swum into a machine gun's fire to save 3 lives, and who describes the experience by reaching for the memory of a lazy river back home. It is the opposite of the boastful warrior. It is a small man quietly refusing to treat his own extraordinary courage as anything remarkable at all. That detail comes to us through a carefully researched retelling rather than through the official military record, so we should hold it a little more loosely than the citation itself. But it fits everything else we know, and it rings true. After the war, Harold Garman went home. He did not become a general or a senator or a celebrity. He lived the rest of his life largely out of the public eye, an ordinary citizen who happened to wear, on the rare formal occasions that called for it, the pale blue ribbon and small gold star that marked him as one of a tiny handful of Americans to have received his country's highest decoration for valor. He died on the 13th of August, 1992, at the age of 74, in Albion, Illinois, the town he had come from, and he was buried there. The small man from Wayne County, who had once been exactly the sort of soldier that no one would look at twice, ended his life as a Medal of Honor recipient whose award had been pinned to his chest by George Patton in front of a rolling camera, and almost none of his neighbors in later years, seeing the quiet old man, would have guessed the whole of it. It would be easy to end there, on the note of the humble hero come home. But this story is about something larger than one man, and to leave it at Garman alone would be to miss the point that his life illustrates. So let us widen the lens, because Harold Garman was not unique. He was the visible example of a whole category of men whose story deserves to be understood as a category, and the wider truth is even more impressive than the single case. Garman was one of a small number of medics and medical personnel who received the Medal of Honor in the Second World War. These men, taken together, tell a consistent story, and it is worth hearing a few of them, because the pattern is the real revelation. Consider Alfred Wilson, a medic in another of Patton's 3rd Army divisions, the 26th Infantry Division. In November of 1944, in fighting in eastern France near the village of Bézange-la-Petite, Wilson was treating wounded men under heavy fire when he was himself torn by shell fragments. He was, by any reasonable measure, already a casualty who should have thought only of his own survival, and he was offered evacuation. He refused it, because leaving would have meant abandoning men who would die without him. Instead, he kept working, first with his own hands while he still could. Then, as his strength failed and he grew too weak to treat men himself, he began giving verbal instructions to the soldiers around him, talking frightened riflemen step by step through procedures they had never been trained to perform, telling them where to press and how to bandage and what to do next, turning them into temporary medics by sheer force of instruction while his own life ran out. His citation records that through his devotion to duty and personal sacrifice, he helped to save the lives of at least 10 wounded men. He did not survive. His unit, like so many infantry units, had come to love the quiet Pennsylvanian they depended on and had given him affectionate nicknames. He spent the last conscious hours of his life ensuring that other men would keep theirs. Or consider Frederick Murphy, a medic in the 65th Infantry Division, also part of Patton's 3rd Army. In March of 1945, in the fighting at the German border defences known as the Siegfried Line, near the town of Saarlautern, Murphy was wounded early in an attack. He refused evacuation and kept treating casualties, and then his situation became something almost beyond belief. The wounded he was trying to reach lay in a minefield, ground sown with buried explosives that would kill or maim anyone who stepped wrong. Murphy went in anyway. He moved among the mines, treating men where they had fallen, fully aware that any step might be his last. He was working in that minefield when he was killed. Like Wilson, like so many of them, he chose the wounded over himself, again and again, until the choice was taken out of his hands. Both men received the Medal of Honor for those actions, and both received it after their deaths, which is its own quiet statistic. A great many of the medics who earned that award did not live to be handed it. That last fact deserves a moment, because it sets Harold Garman's story slightly apart even within this company of heroes. Wilson died. Murphy died. So many of the medics whose courage reached the level of the nation's highest honor reached it only by dying, their awards pinned to a folded flag and handed to a mother or a widow rather than to the man himself. Garman lived. He swam into the fire, saved his 3 men, and came back out of the water alive, and then survived the rest of the war and went home. That is part of why the film of his ceremony is so precious. For most of these men there could be no such film, because there was no living man left to decorate. Garman standing there in Lich, breathing, in front of Patton, is a rare thing. He is the mocked medic not only vindicated, but present to see his own vindication, which the majority of his equals never were. These men, Garman and Wilson and Murphy and the others like them, form a pattern so consistent that it stops being a series of individual coincidences and becomes something like a definition, the definition of what a combat medic was, at his best, in that war. Not a man who happened to be brave, but a man whose entire role was built around a specific and repeated kind of courage that ran directly against the strongest instinct a human being has, the instinct to preserve one's own life. Over and over, in different divisions, on different battlefields, against different enemies, these men made the same choice. The scale of the war means we will never know the names of most of the medics who made it, because most of them were not filmed, and not decorated, and not remembered by history at all. They simply did the job, and a great many of them died doing it, in the anonymous way that most of the war's real heroes died. To see just how deep this pattern of the mocked medic ran, and how completely it could reverse, it is worth stepping away from Patton's army entirely for a moment, to the other side of the world, and to the single most famous doubted medic of the entire war. His name was Desmond Doss, and it is important to say clearly and up front that his story has nothing to do with Patton at all. Doss did not serve in Europe. He served in the Pacific, with the 77th Infantry Division, against the Japanese. He never met Patton and never fought under him, but his story belongs here anyway because it is the purest and best documented example of the exact arc this whole account is about, the arc from mockery to reverence, and it shows that the pattern was not a coincidence of one man or one army. It was something built into what a medic was. Desmond Doss was a Seventh-day Adventist from Virginia, and his religious faith forbade him to carry a weapon or to take a life. He volunteered for the army anyway, determined to serve as a medic, to save men rather than to kill. And for that combination, a soldier who refused on principle to touch a rifle, he was mocked more savagely than almost any man in this story. His fellow soldiers ridiculed him, they abused him, some threw things at him while he prayed. His officers tried to get rid of him, to have him discharged as unfit, to push him out of the army as a liability who would endanger other men by refusing to fight. He was, in the most literal and sustained way, the medic everyone mocked. The scorn that most medics absorbed in some general form, Doss absorbed in concentrated and personal form, precisely because he took the non-combatant principle further than anyone around him. And then came Okinawa, and a place the soldiers called Hacksaw Ridge, a sheer escarpment that American troops had to climb and hold against ferocious Japanese resistance. In the fighting there, in the spring of 1945, Doss did something that silenced every man who had ever mocked him. When his unit was driven back off the top of the ridge under murderous fire, the wounded were left behind on the exposed plateau. Doss refused to leave them. Alone, without a weapon, under fire, he went to each wounded man, dragged him to the edge of the cliff, and lowered him down the face of the escarpment. On a rope sling he tied himself, one man at a time. And then he went back for the next one. Each time he lowered a man to safety, he is said to have prayed the same short prayer, asking only for the strength to reach one more. He kept going for hours. The official recognition of what he did credits him with saving a very large number of men in that single action, an achievement so far beyond ordinary expectation that the exact figure was debated, with estimates ranging into the dozens. Desmond Doss became the first conscientious objector in American history to receive the Medal of Honor. The man they had tried to throw out of the army for refusing to carry a gun ended the war as one of its most decorated soldiers, and his name became a symbol throughout his division of what raw courage without violence could look like. The reason Doss belongs in a story about Harold Garman, despite serving an ocean away and never crossing paths with Patton, is that the two men proved the same point from opposite ends of the war. In Europe, a small, quiet draftee swims into machine gun fire to tow a boat of wounded men and is honored in person by the hardest general in the army. In the Pacific, a religious objector who would not touch a rifle lowers dozens of men down a cliff under fire and becomes a legend. Different theaters, different enemies, different men, and the identical arc. Mocked before combat for what they would not do, revered after combat for what they did. The Patton was not about one exceptional individual, it was about the nature of the role itself. That is the context that gives Harold Garman's story its true weight. He is not important because he was one of a kind. He is important because he was representative, a single, clearly documented and even filmed example of a kind of man who existed by the thousands and whose collective courage held the American army's wounded away from death. When you watch the film of Patton saluting Garman, you are not really watching a general honor one exceptional individual. You are watching the American army, through its most famous soldier, salute an entire category of men who had been doubted and mocked in the training camps, and who had answered that doubt in the only currency that silences it, which is the willingness to die for someone else. Now we can return to the question this whole account has been circling and answer it properly. Why did the mockery reverse so completely? Why did the men who had sneered at the medics in Georgia and Texas come to love them without reservation in Normandy and France and Germany? The shallow answer, the one we set aside near the beginning, is that the medics turned out to be brave after all. That is true, but it explains nothing, because everyone on that battlefield was brave, or did not last long. The deeper answer is about the specific nature of the medic's courage and what it meant to the men around him. A rifleman's courage protected himself and his mission. It was aimed outward, at the enemy, and it carried with it at least the possibility of striking back, of doing something to the source of the danger. The medic's courage had none of that. He could not shoot back. He could not eliminate the threat. He could only expose himself to it, deliberately and repeatedly, for the sake of someone else. And crucially, the man he exposed himself for was, very often, you, the soldier being saved. Every infantryman on that field knew, with total certainty, that if he himself were hit, the only thing standing between him and death in the dirt was the willingness of that small unarmed man to come out and get him. The medic was, for every soldier in the line, a personal insurance policy written in another man's blood. You do not mock the man you know might save your life. You do not sneer at the figure you might in your worst moment scream for. It was not sentiment that changed their minds. It was the coldest kind of clarity. In the training camp, the medic was an abstraction, a man who would not carry a rifle. In combat, the medic was the specific person who might reach you when you were dying. That transformation, from abstraction to lifeline, is the whole of it, and it happened in the mind of every soldier the first time he saw a medic go out under fire. And this is where the two halves of the famous title finally meet and make sense. The medic everyone mocked, and the general who honored him. They are not two separate stories. They are the same truth seen from two ends. The infantry mocked the medic before combat and revered him after, because combat revealed what the medic actually was. And Patton, the hardest and most demanding judge of soldiers in the entire army, performed the same reversal at the highest level, in front of a camera, when he chose to salute Harold Garman with his own hand. The private soldiers learned to honor the medic one terrible field at a time, each man converted by the first rescue he witnessed. Patton did it for all of them at once, in a single filmed gesture in a German town. The mockery and the salute are the beginning and the end of one single arc, the arc that runs from doubt to reverence, and the thing that carries a man across that arc is not words and not rank. It is the willingness, proven in the open under fire, to go toward the wounded when every instinct says to run the other way. There is a final point to make, and it concerns why this true story is better than the invented one, because that difference is not just a matter of accuracy, it is a matter of meaning. The invented version, the one where Patton dramatically demands a specific medic by name, makes the medic important because a great man noticed him. It puts the general at the center and makes the medic's worth depend on the general's attention. The true version does the opposite. In the true version, Garman's courage exists entirely on its own, out on that river, witnessed mostly by ordinary soldiers, complete and finished before Patton ever heard the name. The salute at Lich did not create the man's worth, it only recognized it. Patton did not lend Garman his importance. Garman had already earned it, alone, in the water, months before, and Patton merely had the honesty to see it, and the grace to stand at attention before it. That is a far greater thing to say about a small man from Illinois than any invented drama could ever be. It says that his courage did not need a famous witness to be real. It only found one. The paratrooper and the tank and the general are the images the war left us, the loud and famous machinery of history. But the war was also decided, quietly and constantly, by men who carried no weapons and killed no one, and simply refused to let the wounded die alone. They were mocked before anyone understood them, and honored once everyone did. Harold Garman was one of them, and we are lucky, genuinely lucky, that on one spring day in a ruined German town, a camera happened to be running, so that we can still watch the hardest general of the war come to a halt in front of the smallest kind of hero, and salute. If this account gave you something to think about, the real man underneath a legend that did not need inventing, then hit the like button and subscribe. It is how stories like this one, told with the facts intact, reach the people who care about getting the history right.